The lawyer barely looked up from the document when he said it, almost like it was routine. The majority of the estate is to be transferred to Clara Whitman. A few heads turned. My mother's breath caught, but she didn't speak. Neither did I. It wasn't the money. It was the silence around it, the way the words landed with no explanation, no context, like the decision had always been inevitable. I glanced down at the last page. That signature? I'd seen my grandfather write his name hundreds of times. Tax. Returns, birthday cards, even grocery lists pinned to the fridge. This one looked unfamiliar. The slope was wrong. The loop in the G was too tight. Clara sat straight, hands folded, nodding as if this was some tragic honor thrust upon her. But something in me didn't settle. Not anger, just stillness. The kind that waits and watches, and quietly begins to question everything. My name's Daniel Whitman. I'm 32, work as an accountant for a mid-sized logistics firm, and I've lived in the same two-bedroom condo just outside Oak Ridge since I graduated college. I don't make headlines. I don't make waves. But I keep my promises, file things on time, and I don't forget who stood by me when it wasn't easy. My father died when I was 10. A heart attack in his sleep. He wasn't old, just unlucky. After that, it was just Mom and me. She did her best to hold things together, worked 2 jobs for a while, leaned on neighbors, stretched every dollar. But the real anchor in our lives was my grandfather. He wasn't loud or affectionate in the way some grandfathers are. He didn't tell long stories or bring gifts wrapped in gold foil. What he gave was quieter, reliable. He showed up to every school meeting, taught me how to calculate compound interest, and once gave me $500 to buy a used laptop for my college classes. Told me to pay it back when I had my first real job. I did. With interest. He was the kind of man who believed in earning your keep, but never letting pride get in the way of helping family. He owned a modest property, drove a 15-year-old truck, and kept everything: bank records, bills, even old grocery. Receipts in neat labeled folders. We weren't close in a storybook sense, but I trusted him more than anyone. And I believe he trusted me too. That's why the will didn't sit right. He never promised me anything, and I never expected to inherit land or money. But I know his values. I know what fairness meant to him, and whatever this was, it didn't feel like fairness. It felt like something had been rearranged, quietly, by someone who thought no one would notice. They were wrong. Clara wasn't always around. For most of my life, she was the relative who showed up late to family gatherings and left before dishes were cleared. She had this breezy charm that people mistook for warmth. But I'd learned early on that Clara was only dependable when something benefited her directly. Still, I never imagined she'd sink into something like this. It started slowly. A few months before my grandfather's health really declined, she began visiting more often, dropping off casseroles, offering to take the load off by running errands, organizing his prescriptions. It wasn't that I was suspicious. I actually felt relieved. For once, someone else in the family was stepping in, and it wasn't just Mom handling everything. Clara said the right things. We should all be more present. He deserves comfort in his last years, and I just want to make things easier for everyone. At the time, I thought maybe she'd grown up a little. What I didn't realize then was how neatly those acts of kindness had also positioned her next to his filing cabinet, his checkbook, and eventually his attorney. The memory that kept looping in my head after the will reading was one of the last good conversations I had with Grandpa. He was in his favorite chair, blanket over his knees, the afternoon sun falling across the floor. We weren't talking about anything important, just taxes, as usual. He said, almost offhandedly, "You and your mother will be fine. I've made sure of it." It wasn't dramatic. He didn't say it like some grand promise. It was quiet confidence. The kind of thing you say when a decision's already been made. That line haunted me, because sitting in that conference room, listening to the lawyer list out Clara's full control over the estate, I couldn't make it a lie. Something was missing, or more likely, something had been added. Clara didn't just attend the will reading. She stood beside the attorney like she'd rehearsed it. She nodded at all the legal jargon, interjected when my mother quietly asked a question, and ended the meeting with this sickening line. Dad always said he trusted me to handle the tough stuff. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. Too smooth. Too prepared. That's when I looked again at the signature. My grandfather had a strong hand, even in his later years. His loops were wide. The W always had a little lean to the left. On that will, it was almost rigid, like someone had practiced copying it, but couldn't quite mimic the pressure. And that's when something changed for me. Until then, I'd been trying to make sense of it all, give her the benefit of the doubt. But in that moment, I stopped thinking like a grandson and started thinking like an auditor. Whatever was going on here wasn't just a clerical mix-up. This wasn't grief clouding judgment. This was a document, a final record. And if it had been altered, then so had the truth. Clara had always played the long game. But if she thought no one would notice a crooked signature, she'd clearly forgotten who she was dealing with. No one said much after the reading. We walked out into the hallway, papers still in hand, and for a moment, it felt like we were just attendees at someone else's meeting. Not family, not heirs, just bystanders. My mother was pale, gripping her handbag with both hands. She gave a tight smile and said, "Maybe your grandfather changed his mind." Her tone wasn't angry, just tired. Tired in a way I hadn't seen before. I nodded. There was no reason to argue, but I didn't believe it. Not for a second. Back home, I pulled out my laptop and started searching quietly. I wasn't looking for loopholes or ways to fight a will. I wanted to understand what could have happened, how a document like that could go unquestioned, what legal checks existed, who oversaw these things. My bookmarks filled up quickly. Probate law, contested. Estates, power of attorney limitations. It wasn't driven by greed. That part was clear to me. If the money was truly meant for Clara, fine. But that signature, its stiffness, it wouldn't let me sleep. Accounting trains you to see patterns. You learn to spot when things don't reconcile, when numbers are massaged or shifted to tell a different story. This didn't feel like a clerical oddity. It felt like something had been rewritten. At dinner the following weekend, Clara hosted the family at her place. Polished silverware, catered food, a little slideshow of Grandpa's old photos playing in the corner. She raised her glass and toasted to honoring Dad's legacy and keeping the family close. Everyone clapped politely. I watched her. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she held the wine glass. I don't think anyone else noticed. That's when I knew. She wasn't celebrating. She was managing optics, performing stability. I said nothing, smiled when expected, passed the mashed potatoes. But mentally, I began filing things, dates, phrases, behavior. She had built a story. I just needed to find the cracks. The first thing I did was request a certified copy of the will. It arrived 3 days later in a stiff envelope, stamped and sealed, like any other legal form I'd reviewed in the past. But this one felt different, heavier somehow. I opened it at my kitchen table, scanned every line slowly, and went straight to the signature page. Same as before, something about it felt foreign. The spacing was too rigid. The downstroke on the W lacked its usual lean. I pulled out a folder from the hall closet where I kept old birthday cards from Grandpa, back when he'd write full notes instead of just his name. Some of them were more than 10 years old, but his handwriting had remained surprisingly consistent over the years. Broad strokes, firm pressure, a casual but confident flair in the tail of each N. Laying the documents side by side felt like holding up a photograph next to a sketch. At first glance, they were similar, but the energy was missing. The life in the line, the practiced ease, it just wasn't there. I wasn't a handwriting expert, but I was trained to notice what didn't add up. The more I looked, the more I noticed. The signature on the will lacked baseline alignment. His name floated unevenly on the page, like someone unsure of where the line was. And the pressure was inconsistent, light in some places, too heavy in others. I had seen this before in a different context, when clients tried to forge expense receipts, thinking no one would notice the difference in ink tone or printer settings. I needed someone who did this for a living. A former colleague of mine, Melissa, came to mind. She had transferred departments a few years back to work in forensic audit. Estate fraud wasn't her specialty, but she pointed me toward a licensed handwriting examiner named Raymond Shaw, who had testified in probate cases before. I sent him a message with a brief overview, attached scans of the will and a few of my grandfather's older documents, and followed up with a phone call. He was methodical, even a little cold, but that's what I wanted. Someone who didn't care about family politics, just lines on paper. He asked for originals or certified copies of all samples. No scans, no digital comparisons. He needed to feel the pressure in the stroke, examine the ink, the paper texture. I mailed everything overnight, paid the expedited fee, and waited. The call came a week later. There's a 90%. The moment I hung up with the handwriting expert, I knew I had enough to move forward, but not recklessly. This wasn't something to shout about over dinner or bring up in a text thread with distant cousins. If I was going to challenge what Clara had done, it had to be quiet, methodical, and legally airtight. First, I spoke with a probate attorney, a former client of mine, actually, someone I'd helped through a tax audit 2 years earlier. He remembered the favor and agreed to take a look. I sent over the will, the handwriting report, and a typed-up summary of the timeline. He called me the next morning and said, "This is serious, but you've got to play it smart." The key, he explained, wasn't to scream forgery. That could backfire without the right procedural framing. The smarter route was to request a temporary freeze on the estate's distribution, just long enough to prompt a judicial review. No accusation, just caution. So I wrote the letter. 3 pages. Factual, precise, no emotional language. I laid out the inconsistencies in the signature, attached the certified handwriting analysis, included samples of my grandfather's known writing, and formally asked the estate attorney to pause any remaining disbursements until a court could evaluate the situation. It was a request, not a declaration of war. His reply came 2 days later. One sentence, buried halfway down the email. Several liquid assets have already been dispersed to Ms. Whitman pursuant to her rights as executor. That's when it clicked. She wasn't just waiting to receive. She'd already started collecting. I knew what that meant. Once assets move, they become harder to trace, harder to claw back. The longer I waited, the more permanent her victory would become. So I filed a formal petition in probate court. Not to demand the money for myself. That wasn't the goal. It was a petition for clarity, for the court to determine whether it's reflected my grandfather's true intent, and whether the signature met legal standards. The handwriting expert agreed to testify if needed. The attorney helped me prepare an evidence packet, expert testimony, documented timeline, original samples. I even included notes from my grandfather's calendar that conflicted with the will signing date. He'd been hospitalized that entire week. Thought every move I made was quiet but deliberate. No shouting matches, no family group chats, no confrontation. Just facts, layered slowly and carefully. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring the shape of something that had been bent just enough to fool most people, but not me. And Definitely not the court. The courthouse was plain beige and quiet, nothing like the high-stakes drama you'd expect from legal television. There were no gasps, no slamming gavels, just fluorescent lights, the soft shuffle of paperwork, and people waiting to be heard. That morning, I arrived 15 minutes early and sat outside the hearing room, reviewing everything one last time. I wasn't nervous, just focused. Clara walked in 5 minutes before the start. She wore a tailored black blazer, hair pulled tight, a light pink folder in her hand. She looked like someone arriving for a meeting she thought she'd already won. Our eyes met briefly. She smiled, that vague kind of smile meant to suggest this was all beneath her. Then she turned to greet the estate attorney, like they were old friends sharing a minor inconvenience. The judge was an older man, measured, deliberate. He opened with the facts. A petition had been filed disputing the validity of the decedent's will on the grounds of possible forgery. No emotion, just process. Clara's attorney spoke first, brushing it off as an unfortunate misunderstanding, rooted in family grief. Clara nodded along, eyes fixed on the judge like a student trying to win favor. When she finally spoke, she kept her voice light. My father trusted me to manage everything. This was his decision. I understand the suspicion, but Daniel and his mother were never promised anything. She said it like a defense, but it was really an attempt to reframe the narrative, position herself as the dutiful daughter, unfairly. Targeted. Then Raymond Shaw took the stand. The expert was everything I'd hoped he'd be: blunt, methodical, and utterly uninterested in our family drama. He began by presenting side-by-side samples on projection screen, one from the will, others from financial records, letters, even the back of an old check. He pointed to inconsistencies, baseline alignment, ink spread, tremor marks, suggesting slow tracing. Explained how the pressure patterns contradicted my grandfather's known writing habits. This signature, he said, lacks the spontaneous fluidity of natural writing. In my expert opinion, it was replicated deliberately and with effort. For the first time, Clara shifted in her seat. Not a lot, just enough. Her hand moved toward her necklace, fingers tightening around it. She didn't look at me. The judge asked a few questions. Nothing aggressive, just clarifications. When he paused, pen hovering over the case folder, I could feel the room tighten. Everyone knew what was happening, even if no one said it aloud. Clara tried to salvage it. Claimed the signature must have been shaky because her father had good days and bad ones. Claimed maybe the witnesses hadn't remembered clearly. Claimed she'd only followed his verbal instructions, but facts don't flinch, and signatures don't rewrite themselves. The judge called for a full audit of the estate. Temporary freeze reinstated. Additional document reviews ordered. Clara's role as executor suspended pending investigation. No one clapped. No one gasped. But it was over. 3 weeks later, I received an email confirming the audit's findings. The will had been tampered with. The signature did not meet authenticity standards. A new executor would be appointed, and any improperly distributed funds were subject to recovery. I didn't tell anyone. Not right away. Let the system finish what it started. The next family event was a small memorial. My mother hosted a quiet dinner, mostly cousins and distant relatives. Clara showed up late, didn't bring anything, and kept her coat on the whole time. She didn't make eye contact with me. Not once. I didn't need her apology. Just the silence. That was enough. 3 months passed before the court sent its final ruling. The estate was to be redistributed under court supervision, with Clara formally removed as executor. My mother received a modest but appropriate share. Enough to cover the expenses she'd shouldered alone for years, helping with Grandpa's care, running errands, covering gaps in his insurance paperwork. It wasn't a windfall, and it didn't need to be. It was recognition. As for me, I declined my portion. The court gave me the option, even encouraged a disbursement for my efforts and expenses. I thanked them, but I let it go. That was never why I got involved. The truth, when you strip everything else away, is rarely glamorous. No dramatic fallout, no confessions or apologies, just absence. Clara slowly disappeared from birthdays and barbecues. No one told her not to come, but the invitation stopped. Conversations turned when her name came up. Her influence, once subtle and polished, had turned brittle. It couldn't hold under scrutiny. And that's what justice looks like sometimes. Not a courtroom speech or a public shaming. Just a gradual removal from spaces where trust matters. I returned to my routines. Back to spreadsheets, quiet weekends, catching up with my mom over coffee. The only thing that had really changed was my understanding of how fragile things like truth and legacy can be when no one's guarding them. Looking back, I don't regret a single hour spent gathering documents, writing letters, or sitting in that courtroom. It taught me that doing the right thing almost never feels urgent. It feels quiet, slow, uncomfortable, and necessary. Grandpa never wanted drama. He was a man who filed things in labeled folders, not someone who chased confrontation. I think he would have appreciated how it played out. No shouting, no chaos, just facts. Presented carefully and resolved with precision. What mattered in the end wasn't money or recognition. It was dignity. His, mine, my mother's. And once it was clear that it had been preserved, the rest didn't matter.